Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Good Advice Podcast, and I'm your host, Blake Benz. I appreciate you tuning into the show today. We're going to talk about shrewdness in business and people who are all too clever about certain decisions they make in their brands and in their businesses. Today's episode is all about, can you cut corners and feel good about it? And I mean, trying to think about how to present this episode. We're going to dive into it today. We're going to talk about it today. Some things that they've been on my mind, some conversations I've had lately in business. All that to say, if you're a first-time listener, this is the place where we talk about how to do business better. None of the fluff or theory, just the stuff that actually works. I appreciate you tuning into the show today. We do have a word from one of the businesses that sponsored today's episode. Check out this quick ad, and we'll be back soon. Do you ever feel like your payment processor is robbing you blind? For some of us, it's not blind. We look at the amount of money that's going to our payment processor month after month, and a lot of times we ask ourselves, is there a better way? I'm making good money, yet so much of it isn't actually ending up in my pocket. In the world of payment processing, in many cases, it's a cashless world, so you have to have a payment processor you can really trust. I personally am a big fan of Brad Norwood, who's the owner of PrimePaymentsUSA.com. Brad's a business owner himself. He knows all the challenges that come with running a business. More importantly, he knows the value of an individual customer. See, some of these bigger businesses, they're all about scale. They're all about bringing in as many customers as possible. But do they know your name? Do they know your business? Do they know what's important to you? In many cases, the answer is no. And in worst cases, they're just looking to get as much money from every transaction that you work hard for, which really doesn't feel too good. So you got to reach out to Brad Norwood today and understand how he's doing business and why it can save you money month after month. More importantly, you might even ask him about his zero-fee payment processing that he's offering to a select few of people. Go to PrimePaymentsUSA.com and start putting the money that you worked hard for back into your pocket. So I was talking to my brother, who's in business and been in business for a long time. And we were just exchanging stories, just making small talk about just, I was talking about the marketing world. He was talking about his world and just swapping stories. And something that came up was he used this word shrewdness. And he said, it surprised me how shrewd and clever people are in business. And he wasn't talking about people who, have a different approach or I never thought about doing it that way. What we were effectively talking about was your conscience. And ultimately, can you run a successful business while doing right by your customers? Now, the reason I bring this up is because I do think there is sort of a whimsical naivety in younger business owners that is very admirable. And, it reminds me of a time where I was hanging out. This is back in college. I was hanging out with a bunch of different people. We were in this big social setting, and someone made a joke. I can't remember what it was, but someone made a joke, and someone in the group didn't get the joke. And, it was kind of a dirty joke is basically what it was. Well, someone in the group didn't get the joke, and then people were razzing that person for not getting it. It was like, oh, come on, how do you not know? Just give them a hard time. And I remember saying to that person, I said, and this is an old Bible verse, by the way, which it's funny when people say old Bible verse, it's all old, right? But something that stood out to me, I said, hey, to the pure, all things are pure. You shouldn't be embarrassed about not knowing something. So, and if nothing else, I think about the innocence of a child. And, as you're growing up, there's something to be said about the, protecting that innocence and, children who get to have a childhood. And, obviously this is all like really heavy, big things to think about. But I don't know. Now that I have kids and my kids are young, I think for me, I think a lot about like the wonder of my kids and as they experience the world. And, there's just certain things that like we don't talk about because um, not because I don't want them to know about how the world works, uh, but because, like a good example is, like my kids don't know what guns. I mean, they do know what guns are. They would probably call them like pew pews is probably what they would call them. But it's only like recently I was talking to my daughter and saying that, that, hey, there's people in the world who do bad things and do evil things. And like, I was even thinking about how do I have this conversation with her in a way that doesn't like bleakly portray the world to her. So, and that's all because again, I want to sort of protect that sense of wonder for her. And when you run a business, when you're young in business, I think there is that sense of wonder and magic. And especially if you've started a business and you've left the corporate world, there is this energy around like, oh man, I'm going to make such a difference. Or as someone I was talking to put it, it was like, we're gonna change the world. We're gonna make the world a better place. And it almost feels kind of silly to talk about, but there are people who step into entrepreneurship who are very whimsical and they are very, you know, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and excited and energized about like meaningful work. I bring all that up because I think the longer you are in your industry and the longer you run your business, the more you get exposed to very clever people. And I use that word very intentionally. I said towards the start of this episode, my brother used the word shrewd. Um, the more I do business, the more I have seen how people have legitimized and, made sense of decisions that I think candidly would be black and white, unethical, immoral. And I think sometimes when we get into these topics, it's like, no, you didn't steal from your customer, but you also didn't tell them the whole story. Or you made it sound like you were doing one thing when really you were doing something else. I think that in some cases, people have very cleverly committed fraud, and the way they talk about it even legitimizes it for themselves that they didn't do anything wrong. A good example of this, we talked about this on the podcast a couple years back on a certain individual who was local, who effectively, in my opinion, defrauded some local businesses of several thousands of dollars. And when this person was confronted about it, they effectively said, well, I'm just a salesperson. It's not really my fault that it didn't plan out. I'm just a sales guy. My job's only to sell it. It's your job to do your due diligence, yada, yada, yada. And I was a bit surprised by how this person had legitimized it in their mind. And the longer I have been in business, the more I have found that there are people like this where the blame is passed on to the consumer. In fact, I was watching I don't know if you guys have ever heard of CoffeeZilla. CoffeeZilla he's crazy popular now. He's a big YouTuber who like focuses on fraud and scams. But this was years ago when he was tiny, much smaller, and he was confronting like an internet marketer about some things that the person was selling. And this was, I have to assume his show is so different now. And I have to assume he's probably tightened up the show a little bit too, because I remember him getting very frustrated, the marketer's getting frustrated, but he's essentially accusing the marketer of like shipping air and selling nothing. And the marketer's basically being like, well, the customer, they're the ones making the decisions. They're the ones who are ultimately, as far as I remember how this conversation went, But the marketer's basically saying like, I mean, they are making the decision. And so it was interesting how he just kept pointing back to the consumer, kept pointing back to the customer. I have been in many marketing groups over the years. I've met many marketers. I've met many business people. Um, and I'll just say I've never had someone overtly, like directly talk about scamming people, but I have seen people over the years toe the line. And I think honestly, people genuinely sometimes believe in the things that they say. There's an expression that I used when I was an adjunct professor at the U of A, and I taught this class on ethics and like, good decision making and morality and these kinds of things. And I talked about it was an expression that had been taught to me, which was having a seared conscience. I don't know the source or like the origin of the expression, but effectively, it's where your decision making is so painted towards these wrong decisions that you're like the mechanism of, hey, this is wrong. You probably shouldn't do this. Like it doesn't fire correctly. I know for me, for my customers, I have a deep sense of making sure I'm delivering on everything I say I'm going to deliver, making sure that I'm doing all the things I said I'd be doing, even to the point, probably even too much. I had a mentor years ago where I think I said something like, if the people who work with me, if they aren't making tons and tons and tons of money, I'm going to give them their money back. And he was like, dude, you can't be so purist about this. Like when you work with a customer, you're collaborating together. So if they do nothing and you do everything, ultimately it's still their business. But if they do nothing, there has to be some shared responsibility here and accountability here and, what have you. And I think that's still true today, by the way. I think you know, it- at the end of the day, you can't care more about someone's business than they do. And at the end of the day, I mean, people they're going to make the decisions that they're going to make. So, um, getting back to what I was saying, though, some other examples of this happening. I've told the stories many times of being in marketing groups where people would talk about going to open houses, not open houses, like houses that were being sold, doing camera work and standing or, going through the property in a way that makes it seem like it's their property. The stereotype today, and it's been memed to death only because it was outed as something that people were doing, and now it's much more quickly called out. But people who rent expensive cars for the day, they drive it around, they talk about all the success they're having. And again, at the end of the day, when you have conversations with these people and you talk to them and I didn't want to say confront them. It's not like I'm out there confronting all these people, but when you have conversations, you realize that some of these people have really legitimized in their mind the way that they do things, the way that they sell things, the way they talk about things. Um, and I guess the reason I'm making this episode today is that I guess I get surprised by this isn't a new concept to me. It's certainly not a new concept to many of the listeners of the show. I mean, you've probably met someone like this who, you're kind of like, man, you know what? If a little justice went their way, I wouldn't hate it. If people knew all the things about that person, I wouldn't hate it. Not that you're like, biding your time for when that person gets outed. But like a really good example, I'll give a couple others. In fact, I'll just roll through some examples. But I remember I was working with someone who was a realtor and they were talking about all the amazing success they were having, yada, yada. And then we finally like sat down and had a conversation about revenue and the money that she was making. And she wasn't making any money. She was like totally broke. And I was like, man, who you really are and who you present yourself as on social media, very different people. Another real estate example, I talked to someone else who this person brought up a third party who was presenting all of these deals and sales. And the person said, like all of that information is available. It's like publicly available. And I can tell you this person hasn't sold anything. They haven't sold anything. But again, the way they present it and talk about it and, what have you. And understand this, like I understand there's a little bit of like a game to be played here. If you have a bad month, you're probably not going to get on social media and be like, wow, this was a terrible month. No one worked with me. People must really not see value. Like, you're not going to air every thought, worry, fear, or concern on social media. You're just not. It's kind of the same thing as like if you're a boss and you're frustrated with like a colleague or like a co-owner, you're not going to go to the hourly employee and be like, man, I'm so frustrated. Because even though your frustration may be legitimate, even though you may be genuinely bothered by a decision that was made, people don't always have the context or the maturity or the understanding or the ability to really understand and evaluate where you're coming from. So anyone who's run a business understands that you have some months that are incredible and you have some months that are not incredible. In fact, they may feel incredibly dire. You may feel like cash flow has totally dried up and you're like, dude, what is going on right now? You don't have to air every single problem or pain point or what have you. And I would encourage you that you didn't do that because, again, people, they won't understand and they won't have the context. And, you'll post one time about cash flow being tight, and then there'll be someone who's effectively a gossip who's like, oh man, yeah, they're going out of business, I think, because they don't even know what cash flow means. They have no idea. They just understand like that sounds bad, right? So, and I will say, by the way, as a reverse, this is something that I've had to learn to do myself. It's also important to talk about the wins you have. People won't naturally give credit to what you're doing and the great things that you're doing. So you gotta celebrate the wins. You gotta basically the way that a mentor described it to me was, hey, if you caught the fish, you got to tell people you caught the fish. If you caught the bass, you talk about it. You caught the 20-pound, 30-pound. Actually, I don't I don't fish. I haven't fished in years. I don't know what weight would be impressive, but you caught the massive fish. Talk about it. Yeah, I did this. I made this happen. Because I think it is important that people know the good work that you're doing. And I think also, like, your competition is lying about a lot of things. And so you should celebrate the things you're doing well and the wins that you're having. I think where this thing of shrewdness that I'm talking about today is you're talking about the big fish you caught and you didn't even go fishing. You didn't even do it. You weren't even there. It's like the person on the resume who's like increased or improved the efficiency of the team by 900% and, improved our sales from $200,000 to $58 million. And it's like, wait, what? And it's like, oh, your business was acquired by a parent company that does 58 million of that specific product. So it's like, okay, let's really think about what the implication is versus, and I've had this conversation too with people, by the way, on how to like effectively use social media. And it's like, well, what are you trying to imply? What's the implication here? What are you trying to communicate? And so like, for example, I had a guy who called me, I've told the story 1,000 times, and he was like, yeah, I help consulting companies, get to $1 billion in revenue. So like, what's the implication there? Well, the implication is that this guy has, single-handedly, drastically improved the revenue of businesses. Well, have you actually done that? Who are some of your customers? Talk about it. And something that I've always tried to do with my customers, or like people who are in the buying phase of business with like the marketing company, for example, is I try to always be very transparent about what we've done well and what we haven't done well, things that have worked well and things that haven't worked well. And then I trust my customer to be smart enough to make the right decision. We basically lay all the cards out there. There is no, oh, and if you buy from me, I'll tell you the rest of the formula. It's like, here's what we're going to do. Here's what it looks like. Here's some people it worked really well with. Here's their phone numbers. Here's where you can look them up. Here's where you can reach out to them. Hey, if you want, I'll give you the owner's phone number. You can give them a call, ask them what they think. And then I'm also really candid about things that we're not good at. So I have a customer that I've worked with for a long time. We spent a lot of his money on Google Ads. We never made it work. It did not work. And so someone called me about Google Ads a few weeks ago, and I said, hey, here's the deal. That's not something we're good at. It's not. Now, if you want me to spend your money, I can do that. I can spend your money for you. We can figure it out together. We can learn together. But if you're looking for an agency to just take over your Google Ads and just explode it in growth, I'd probably look somewhere else if I were you. And that's not like being insecure. That's not being, uh, it, guys, it's just about being honest. And I think sometimes we're so sales oriented. And when I talk about shrewdness, I think what people do is they went to like a sales seminar about someone called you about Google advertising, and you knew either you'd never done it before or you had done it and you lost a lot of money or what have you. And so what you say, what these people who are very shrewd say is they say something like, "Oh, we've operated on budgets of $20,000 and have spent X amount of hours uh, you know, processing your Google campaign budget with the goal of getting you a return on your investment." Now, none of that is untrue. And when a customer hears that, the implication is, okay, they've worked with large budgets, which is what I'm interested in. I'm looking for someone to handle my larger budget. They talked return on investment. They're thinking about getting me a return, but very cleverly, and many customers would not pick up on this. The person didn't say anything about actual results. So I think sometimes people in business are more intrigued by how do I be clever about this than just be straightforward and honest. So, like I said, the conversation a few weeks ago, hey, you know what? Probably the most recent example, we spent about $15,000. It was not very successful. Now, I will say here's why I don't think it was very successful. I think it was a very niche situation. I think the traffic wasn't exactly there. I'll be candid. I don't know if we're the right fit, but certainly, if you like the way we do business, we can try to figure it out together. And I have had people in the past who've done business with me from that reason alone is, hey, you know what? I love the way you do business. I love that you're transparent. I know this isn't a simple answer, but let's figure it out. And this is even true, by the way. This like level of transparency is true even for things that we're very good at, even for things that we have a great handle on. I have a great handle on podcasting. We have a great handle on SEO. We have a great handle on from like the consulting side of things, figuring out your price point and sales and really figuring out who your customer is and like operating the business in a more efficient way. But the way we're transparent in that is like SEO, for example. I think I told this story. Someone called me on a Friday and said, let's do some SEO. And they said, yeah, I really need the phone to ring on Monday. And I said, hey, here's the deal. That's not how this works. And other companies may have sold it to you like that, but that's not how it works. This is something that we're going to see a difference way downstream, months down the road. And if you're comfortable with building your brand and generating traffic from an organic standpoint, this time next year, being able to drop maybe some of your paid budget because you're getting so much more organic leads, we can have that be our goal. But if your goal is survival by Monday, dude, save your money. Seriously, save your money. So being candid and transparent. I think I've told this story. I had another potential customer where they were ready. I think they were going to drop $14,000, something like that, on an SEO marketing plan. They were a franchise. They had just bought their franchise. The national, I don't know if I'm using the right words here. The national like brand, like the corporate office that supports all the franchises, they wanted approval of any content. They wanted approval of any web changes. They basically wanted final say. And like from one perspective, I get this because you want like brand uniformity. You don't want The McDonald's franchise, I'm going to guess that like corporate McDonald's doesn't want the McDonald's in random location to talk all about like how much they love veganism. Like it's probably not going to, which by the way, franchise wasn't McDonald's, but it's probably not going to happen. So in a way, I get it. But with this prospective customer, I said, dude, save your money. I'll be candid. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if it's going to work because what I have found is when there is this level of oversight and hands-on, and we want to make sure and we want final say, what I have found is that it deeply slows down the process. And more importantly, it doesn't just slow down the process, but it puts a decision maker in the room who doesn't have the context. They don't have, they don't really know what's going on. They just know they don't like X, Y, or Z for whatever reason. And that's just not the way that I do business. I don't think it's beneficial to you. I don't think it's a good investment. So putting all those cards down, I think I ultimately said, hey, you know what? I mean, if all of that, you still want to do this, we can give it a shot, but it's going to look very different from what we're talking about today. So I just have found that level of transparency and candidness, and then trusting your customer to make the right decision, that ultimately it makes better customers for you long term. And you know what? Like besides like the quality of a customer, I think you just feel better about the way you do business. Like I think about my son, me as a man, decisions I make, my son looking me in the eyes when he's older, he's grown up and asking me about these things. Like there's just something I want to be able to say about my values and the way I do business. And it's not, hear me. It's not that you don't make mistakes. It's not that you don't screw things up. I mean, we had a customer that we deeply screwed something up. This was just a couple of weeks ago. We basically deleted their website by accident. And the customer, I'll be honest, the customer emailed me. We deleted the website at like 3:00 or 4:00 in the afternoon. I didn't see it. I didn't realize this had happened. But one of my team members did this by mistake. And the customer emails me at like 9:00 the next morning and is like, hey, something's going, the website's gone. Like, what, do you know what happened? And I got to be honest, I was so tempted to be like, no, yeah, that's so weird. Like, what did happen? Like, that's crazy. And then, get it back up and be the hero. And, we fixed it. We saved you. And ultimately I said, hey, you know what? We did that. That was our mistake. And the customer was not happy about it. This is something that came up in my ethics class, by the way, of we would talk about, making the right decision. And I'd ask my students, well, why do you make the right decision? And one of the most common answers I would get would be because it pays off long term, because it works out long term. And the thing that I was trying to communicate was, no, it doesn't always work out long term. It doesn't always work out in your favor long term. The reason that people make bad decisions and they defraud people or cheat people or what have you is because in many cases it it goes unnoticed and it doesn't get self-corrected. It doesn't get fixed on its own, and there isn't always karma for these people. I mean, unfortunately, it just is what it is. So in the case of this customer, I wish I could say that I was like, hey, we made the mistake. And they were like, oh, thank you for being honest. You guys are amazing. This is why we do business with you. That's not what happened. The customer was pissed. And they were like, okay, this actually, we had some really important adjustments we had made to the website. And that day, and when the website got deleted, it basically undid those things. We're going to have to redo them. And they just weren't happy about it. And I had to just, eat the blame of that. I wasn't going to blame the team member. And, the other temptation was to be like, well, this guy made the mistake. It wasn't me, but it was like, no, I'm sorry. I apologize that this happened. That was our fault. There's nothing much I can say other than that, it was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened. Here's why it happened. Here's what we're doing to prevent it from happening again in the future. And beyond that, I apologize. I apologize that it happened. So another quick example of that, I was a server in a restaurant, Chewy's years and years ago, and I had this table come out, and I was just gelling well with the table. I knew they were really happy, but bottom line, I screwed up one of the orders. Screwed up the order, and it wasn't like something small. Like I really screwed up the order. It wasn't like, oh, I said no cheese and you put cheese on it. It was like not even the right thing. So because of this, the table got their food, and I think it was like one gentleman didn't get his food. And so we had to make it quickly so that he could get his food. People had kind of eaten their food by the time he got it. And they were like trying to make it to like this concert. It just wasn't a great situation. Well, so anyway, they're like doing the bill, they're doing the tip. And the guy says, "Hey, just curious, that mistake, was that your fault or the kitchen's fault?" And man, I was tempted to say, "Man, yeah, this kitchen, they always screw things up. They always mess things up." And, this is what I'm talking about. Like, I think we'd like to think when you do the right thing, it pays off. And it just doesn't always pay off. I wish I could say that this person, which the person didn't stiff me, by the way. Nothing like bad happened from it. But you think you say something like, "No, it was my fault, and I'm sorry I did." And they say, "You know what? Because of your honesty, I'm going to give you a huge tip." It's not what happened. Okay. And being honest, being truthful, it doesn't always come with a huge celebration and trumpets and fireworks and a massive reward. It doesn't. I mean, I called a customer, I guess it was December or January, and I said, "Hey, I didn't follow through on what I said I was going to do." And the customer was great. The customer was like, "Yep, I totally get it." And I just said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't keep my word. Here's why I didn't keep my word. It's not an excuse. It's just, I want you to understand my frame of thinking and some things that I was challenged with that kept me from, appropriately doing what I said I was going to. And ultimately, I'm sorry." And the customer said, "I get it. No big deal." But the customer was not, "Well, hey, let's double our budget. Let me throw some more money at you. This was great." It didn't happen. So if there is not a big celebration or a big trophy or what have you, why do you do the right thing? And I think I've done this before. I think I've shared this before, but there's a poem that I had a boss share with me years ago, probably a decade ago. And the poem's called "The Man in the Glass." This is by Peter Dale Wimbrow Sr. And here's the poem. "When you get what you want in your struggle for self and the world makes you king for a day, just go to the mirror and look at yourself and see what that man has to say. For it isn't your father or mother or wife whose judgment upon you must pass. The fellow whose verdict counts most in your life is the one staring back from the glass. He's the fellow to please, never mind all the rest, for he's with you clear to the end. And you've passed your most difficult, dangerous test if the man in the glass is your friend. You may fool the whole world down the pathway of years and get pats on the back as you pass. But your final reward will be heartache and tears if you've cheated the man in the glass." Wherever you are in your business, even if everyone around you is making questionable decisions, keep your sense of self, keep your integrity, and appreciate the man in the glass. Hey, thanks for listening to today's podcast episode. I so appreciate you tuning into the show, and I hope this is helpful for you in your business, wherever you are in your business journey. Don't forget, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. You can support the podcast for as little as $5 a month. Or if you're a business, you want to sponsor an episode, you can always reach out, Blake at goodadvicecoaching.com. That's today's good advice. I appreciate you. See ya.